Welcome back to the Call Up. We have a special episode today, not only because it's the third episode of the week and we're getting back onto that grind, but because we have a special guest as well. Frankie Piliere, the Marlins director of amateur scouting, joins the show. And Jack, as you know, this was going to be a blast for me. I know
Yep.
when you were setting this up, it was something that I know you were like, oh, you're going to love this. Like, can't wait for it. And it was a blast because so many questions about the draft that I think the audience is really going to find valuable. It's not just about the Marlins. Like, we weren't really talking Marlins draft. It's more how the draft works, how somebody like Frankie approaches this and the industry in general, and just how there's still so much up in the air on how you can go about the process, which makes it so much fun.
I'm biased because he's obviously a Marlin. He is the Marlins director of amateur scouting. I'm also biased because Frankie's probably sick of me at this point. I think this is the third interview I've done with Frankie over the last month and a half, 2 months. But at the end of the day, you can listen to this and not know which team he's the director of amateur scouting for. Like he will draw a comparison to a recent Marlins draftee and just hey, here's how we interpret based on this guy, like this is his reference point because he drafted that guy. But this really is a MLB draft for dummies type episode, and it's not for dummies.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
for you, it's for me, it's for everybody that kind of understands what goes into the MLB draft, but also understand what a lead decision maker thinks leading up to that. This guy's running a draft, and he was in the room for Seattle, who we've talked about, maybe the best drafting team in Major League Baseball over the
Up there.
last decade. Like they nail every single upper round pick, first, second round. They don't miss right now. And Frankie learned how to do that under Jerry DiPoto, under Scott Hunter, who I think is their director of amateur scouting. And Peter Bendix ID'd a phenomenal baseball mind. And I'm really excited for you guys to hear this.
I think, and we talked about it a little bit, but I think, and understandably so, because it's so complicated, and again, it's different for every team and how they go about it. But fan versus what's behind the curtain, and I would even say writer and analyst versus what goes on behind the curtain. I don't think there's more of a gap between what is publicly known and what is privately known than how teams approach the draft and what actually goes on in the draft process. And of course, we're not going to get all of those secrets, but even just being able to talk about some of those things and understand a little bit more of what goes into the process, I think is so fascinating. And there was one thing that really stood out to me before we just kicked to it is and we see it a lot with like mock drafts and with draft rankings. And we could say the same thing about prospect rankings as well, but at least you have a little bit more of democratized information. Of course, still you have the back end data, things like that. But a lot of times when we put out these draft rankings, it's like, oh, how do you have this guy over that guy? Or like, this guy's definitely top 10. And you have a director of amateur scouting saying it's way more wide ranging than you think.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important for people to hear because, like, a lot of times, especially in the draft, and like we're guilty of it too. There's been times where I'm like, oh, how'd they do that pick? And sometimes you'll be right, but it is a good reminder of wait and see. It may age poorly and you may be right, but wait and see because some teams also may have had a player that high on their board, and some teams may have had that player way down the board for them. It was interesting to just get that reminder from someone in his position that the board across 30 teams is as more wide ranging than you probably think.
Yes. And I think that's important because I hear a lot of GMs and I hear a lot of people in Frankie's position around Major League Baseball do their post draft media availability and they use the term my board, or our board. Like this guy was at this spot on our board. Okay, like our board is not just a printout of just baseball's top draft prospects or a mock
No.
draft. Like there's so much more that goes into that. And I want you to think about how just baseball's mock draft or how their draft rankings will differ from MLB.com's and how that will differ from Baseball America's, how that will differ from any other outlet that you look at. And think there are 30 other Major League Baseball teams that are doing the exact same thing. And
And
they're
two of them
not
are the Rockies and the Padres, or the Rockies and the Dodgers. Like, so think about
right.
that side of things too.
Right. So everything is going to look different, man. You talk about spraying the board. We are spraying the board with opinion. There are 30 opinions on the same guys that are going to be in this bucket. The other thing that kind of fascinates me is the concentration process, or I guess the filtration process to get to that pick. It's very abstract, right? Guys don't know, Major League Baseball teams don't know who they're drafting at 17th overall until that pick comes across the ticker. And I feel like we fall into a rut of just assuming that everybody knows who they're picking.
Yeah, you got plan A, B, C, D, E. Like that's the other side
You
of
you
things
might
too.
start, you might get past Z and go to like A underscore one, B
Yeah,
underscore one.
which is, and that's the fun part of this whole thing. But it also like I gotta say, I dream of being in a position like that because it sounds amazing, but it sounds like the most organized chaos of all time, and that's why I have
Yeah.
so much respect for what goes into it, and the fact that Frankie took some time out of his day, a few weeks out of the draft here to talk to us.
I asked him about his hotel points too. One of the first times I conversed with him, and he's living large right now. I mean, think about how much travel you have to do in a
Oh,
position like that, like going from showcase to college to showcase to college to the Cape for a minute. He's living large right now with the airline miles and the hotel points. So if you're a rewards guy, I think try and become a director of amateur scouting. But you're going to hear from Frankie in a moment. Before that, I want to tell you about our friends at Ethos Life Insurance. Everybody has one of those experiences that makes you think about life insurance, right? You could have a kid all of a sudden and you say, wow, what would happen if I was not protected? And when you lose someone close to you on the sadder end, you can't help but think about the future. Would your family be prepared financially if anything were to happen to you? The last thing you want your family to worry about is how they're going to pay the bills. But with life insurance from Ethos, your family's protected. Ethos is an online platform that makes getting life insurance fast and easy to protect your family's future in minutes, not months. No complicated process. It's 100% online. There's no medical exam required. You answer a few health questions, you get a quote in as little as 10 minutes. You can get same day coverage without ever leaving your house. And it's a trustworthy company that disrupts the traditional life insurance industry. As of March of 2025, Business Insider named Ethos the number one no medical exam instant life insurance provider. 3 million families have completed their applications and trusted Ethos to help find the right coverage. Ethos has a 4.8 out of 5 stars on Trustpilot with over 2,400 reviews. Protect your family with life insurance from Ethos. Get your free quote at ethos.com/justbaseball. That's ethos, ethos.com/justbaseball. Time for Frankie. Frankie Piliere is the Marlins director of amateur scouting. Frankie has had to suck up conversations with me now 3 times, I think. We did twice on the Marlins pod, and now we're taking it to Just Baseball. But Frankie, thank you so much for taking the time in what I know has been a crazy couple of months now. Is it dying down a teensy bit before next week in the draft ramp up?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. It dies down a little bit for a minute. There's always just a little bit of a trough right before we kind of go right into our draft bunker and start our meetings in full swing. But there's always like a little bit of a lull before you pick back up, sort of post combine, and then it gets crazy all over again.
I was talking to Peter Bendix real quick in San Francisco on field, and I said, I was meeting with Frankie, and he said he went home for some much needed home time before he comes back and goes into his bunker again. So I appreciate that you echoed that sentiment.
Bingo. That's exactly right.
I was gonna piggyback on that and say like I feel like there's no perfect time for the draft. We were talking about it when I was just out in Omaha covering the College World Series, and we're like, remember when guys were getting drafted while still playing in the College World Series? Like that was a little bit chaotic. But then I know there's a lot of just discourse about just how chaotic it is to have it during the All-Star week. And there really isn't a perfect time. But since that shift has been made, is that a really just unmatched busiest time of the year for you guys? I imagine the deadline's pretty crazy too, which isn't far after that. But since they've made it an All-Star week, how is your management of like time and just kind of working through the process and everything changed, or maybe not that much at all?
Probably the main thing is the way we cover summer ball. Like it used to be sort of this natural transition from draft happens in June, your whole staff heads out to the Cape Cod League, all the showcases, and now there's sort of that cross section where it's like there's always a few week span where you're kind of working on two things. Obviously, 90% of your focus is on this present year draft, but you need to have your eye on, we need to assign some people to cover these events. That's probably the main thing. The actual present year draft itself doesn't doesn't create too much chaos because it almost feels like you have more time than you need.
Hmm.
You have a little bit of extra time if somebody's playing in the Cape or playing in the draft league to go see him one more time. But you do feel very good about where you're at. Like, if you're discovering brand new information in the last few weeks, like it's probably not the best thing, but you do have the time to sort of like dot your I's and cross your T's. But you do kind of feel like by the time you get to June, like, okay, we can do this, but now we have these few extra weeks to really get things together.
I do want to get to kind of your beginnings in the amateur scouting world, but that gives me a follow up because Arm and I both called games out on Cape Cod before the date shift to in the draft, and it was a league where it was entirely focused on the draft the year following and 2 years following. Right, the guys going into their sophomore year and going into their junior year. It's like, okay, I'm doing some forecasting here. Now, how much can a Cape start? Like Cam Collier, right? Played what, 10
Mhm.
games in Katuitt? How much can a Cam Collier
Yep.
10-game sample at Katuitt influence his draft stock?
It shouldn't be that much. It depends on the player, depends on the age. Collier being the unique circumstance that he was, like it definitely helped. Okay, wood bat in his hand, he's very young. How does he do against this advanced competition level? It should move your needle a little bit, but it's always a matter of being careful of it's just like anything else. Like you don't want any one thing to move it too much, but Collier was a good example. I do think it's, for instance, if you hadn't seen the player with a wood bat before, or he hadn't, if it was a player coming from smaller school competition, that could be a factor. But if it's a ACC, SEC player that we've got 2 or 3 years of samples on, maybe that sample means a little bit less when he goes out to the Cape. But it does mean something, and it can mean something in different ways. Like, you're not going to put too much stock into maybe his surface performance, but a max exit velocity with a wood bat, pretty important. Some things that stabilize a little quicker, maybe a little bit more important.
I noticed with arms specifically too, like maybe that's an area where because it's
Sure.
just you get a couple starts of whoa, that stuff maybe wasn't there at the end of the year, or maybe it's a guy that didn't have enough innings. Would you say pitchers maybe can disproportionately impact their stock on a positive way with 2 or 3 starts on the Cape versus 10 to 15 games of a hitter?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. That's why I think you see even the draft league, you see movers in that league a little bit more often be pitchers because it's one start of good TrackMan data. If it wasn't there before, it's sort of hard to fake that. If you throw 15 good breaking balls on TrackMan, it's probably true. It might not mean it's consistent. It might not mean he throws strikes, but you kind of have some evidence that it's there. So I feel like it's quicker in general for a pitcher to sort of change who they are or prove who they are. Like, because if a hitter did that for a few games, you'd be like, yeah, prove it. A pitcher does that for a few games. It's harder to fake.
Same line of questioning about the MLB draft combine because this is one of the new things in Major League Baseball, and it seems like it's a huge win for Major League Baseball as well. You have all these guys in front of Hawkeye and TrackMan, I assume at Chase Field, and you've got all of it on. How much can a combine influence you? I know the guy taking baseball by storm right now, Jacob Mizorowski, was a draft combine guy the
Mhm.
first year that it existed.
Yeah, I think people generally probably overstate that. I have people say to me all the time, like, hey, who really changed things at the combine? I think if you've done your homework and you know these guys, you shouldn't get surprised too often, but it can move the needle. Like it can, like sort of again, sort of like the Cape Cod League question of depends what they've done before. A small school player, a high school guy who we've never been able to work out or see with a wood bat. There are some players where it's okay. We know he can do this now with a wood bat, whether it's BP or not. I think if you're approaching it from what's measurable, what's knowable, and if that moves your needle, I think I can get on board with that. I think if it's he got a couple hits in the game or he threw hard, I'm a little harder to convince, but there's a lot of measurable things that happen at the combine where if you didn't have them before, they could be pretty meaningful.
Anecdotally, when I'm looking at like this draft compared to last draft, it feels like the top half is going to be of the first round, or even just the first round in general, probably skew a little bit more high school heavy, right? If you were just guessing on how the picks will run off, or at least the prospects that are getting the most shine right now, versus last year, a lot of college guys in the top end. Is there how different, I guess, is the process when it's a more high school heavy draft versus a college heavy draft? I imagine there's so much data available now, and even high school guys, you're getting a ton of information, from the summer circuit and things like that. But I'd imagine there's also a little bit of a higher confidence interval in the data that you get from college. What's the difference usually there? Obviously, you're I'm sure preparing for a million high school guys and a million college guys, but when it skews a little bit heavier, maybe in one direction at the top, how does it change in terms of preparing, especially for that first round pick?
Yeah, honestly, it doesn't change too much. It might change the way I'm sitting here thinking today, because, like, for instance, I've said this to a number of people. I do firmly believe when we look back, more often than not, classes we think are weaker or stronger, they kind of end up closer to each other than we think. And I think last year was a good example of better or worse than this year, we'll see over time. But I think last year was more clarity. When you have more college players that are like clear performers at the top, for instance, I think we had a much better idea last year picking 16th, which players would definitely be gone before we picked. It's really not the case this year because of, to your point, I think there's more high school players in the mix overall. And it might not actually fall that way. It still might fall a number of college players. It just kind of depends on the avenue which teams take. I think what we have this year is sort of it's a lack of separation. I think there's really 20 or 30 good overall players that could go in the top 10 or 15 picks, and it's going to be in the eye of the beholder. So I think if anything changes for us, it's probably just the fact of thinking on your feet a little bit more, that you can't rule out as many players. Like, we prepare and we write them all up anyway, but as we get into decision mode, we can't assume that players won't be there.
This might be a silly question, but building on that, would you rather have a draft where wherever you're selecting, there's a pool of 30 guys that could reasonably be taken ahead of where your pick is? Or would you rather kind of know how it's going to run off ahead of that and have generally an idea of the guys that'll definitely be gone?
I think just for my own, this is much less a process answer than it is a mental comfort answer. It would sure be nice to know if the list was narrower,
Yeah.
but it doesn't change any of the way we scout or do it. Like, we have I think it's about 1,200, 1,400 players turned in this year, and a lot of reports on all of them. So, like, it doesn't change much of that. But sure, this time of year, about a few weeks out, it would make my brain a lot more at rest if it was all right. This is the list of players that we'll have in front of us.
Frankie Piliere, I was talking to you a week or so ago, and we talked about your draft day process, and you mentioned you were on the phone a lot with players'
Mhm.
representatives throughout the entire process, and it's like almost trying to put the puzzle together in real time. How much of a hurdle has NIL become over the last couple of years? Is that something that has really reared its head with the high school guys?
I think it's honestly a little bit to some extent on the high school guys. I think it rears up a little bit more later in the draft,
Okay.
when there are typically, it used to be the older college player was, very available on what used to be day three of the draft. Now will be the second part of day two of the draft. A lot of those players have a lot more options now than they used to. And, you can look at it a number of ways. I'm glad a player in general has more opportunities to make the most out of themselves. It used to be, if that it just didn't happen, where the 22, 23-year-old college player had NIL on the table, and now they do in a lot of cases. I don't think it's a drastic impact, but it does come up more often, because I think for the most part, the high school players that we're talking about, the dollar figures are so high in most cases, where I think it's an impact, but it's probably smaller. But I do think it's interesting in the later guys, because they have options too. Like, they could be someone from a small school that is transferring to an SEC school and has a little bit of money on the table.
Building on just kind of the strategy of the draft and the financial aspect of it. Of course, MLB's draft is by far the most unique of any draft of any sport. Our audience generally, I think, would understand what goes into it and how things are kind of unique and different. But what would you say is the biggest disconnect maybe between somebody in your position and the average baseball fan in terms of how the MLB draft works?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think this is not so much a money related answer, but I do think there is far less consensus than people think there is, and different ways that teams value players. They're probably a lot more spread out than people think. We see a boiled down product at the end. We see the lists out there, the MLB.coms of the world doing fantastic job coming up with the consensus. But that consensus could also be 15 teams thinking he's a top 10 player and 15 teams thinking he's a top 30 player and he ends up 20th. Um, but I do think that's why we see, going back to your question kind of about the financial part of it, you'll see a team that goes, wow, I can't believe that team paid him that amount of money or got him for this. And I think what it really comes down to is they just valued him differently, whether that's him or another team. I think what people will see is, well, that was the 20th ranked prospect. He was right. I can't believe he was paid in this way, either high or low. And it's just because the team saw it differently. I think there are way bigger differences in the opinions than probably people realize. And I think it's a healthy and a good thing. Like Jack's heard me talk about this a bunch at this point of like the level of wrongness in the MLB draft says there should be wide opinions where it should be that, hey, I think this guy's going to be a lot better than he thought because that happens all the time. Like we see it over and over and over again where stars come from not the top 10 picks in the draft and vice versa.
Well, and I was going to say how quickly that shifts too. Because when we're putting out our prospect rankings, right, we'll have the draft rankings, and then you get a couple months, maybe, or even just a month at the end of the season, right after the draft, of guys playing ball professionally, especially on the hitter side. And part of me is a little bit worried to like overcorrect because you don't want to fully, like you said, move the needle too much off of a smallish sample. But it's also the first time we're seeing these guys professionally, and you do
Yeah.
start to see across the industry maybe a Cam Smith, which I know we had him high already, but really get pushed up there after a couple weeks. Like how quickly after the draft, and it's not to say, okay, hey, we could have done this better or whatever, and you're already regretting the pick, but how quickly can a guy change his perspective or the perspective on him after the draft? Like how quickly do these things actually shift where it's like, oh wow, he's capable of something maybe we didn't think right away?
I think it can happen quickly. I don't think it necessarily means it does, but on the positive side, when you see things that are like predictive and measurable very quickly, and you mentioned Cam Smith was a good example of that last year, of just went out and proved it very fast. He's kind of giving you very instant feedback and passing a lot of tests very quickly. But I think what it is there are players that are drafted now that are on just very, very different timelines. I think we have players that are on that, like maybe a faster track than we thought, and then some players that are just going to take a number of years to come around. I think the key is just being eyes wide open of when that might happen. You don't want to be shocked by, wow, this player is just taking a lot longer to develop than I thought. And it's bound to happen, but it's what you try to avoid. I think you go in eyes wide open, though, as much as you possibly can on this player at least has a chance to move really quickly and a chance to. We always talk about it. I've used this on Fenwick Trimble was a good example last year. You position yourself to like exceed expectations because I think if we knew exactly what Fenwick Trimble was going to do as a pro right away, he would have been even higher on our draft board. But the fact that we didn't, you just kind of position yourself of players that hey, we think he's this, but he could outproject our forecast pretty quickly because he does X, Y, and Z. And there are other players that are kind of the opposite. You know that the bottom could fall out, or this could take longer than we think. And as long as you're prepared for it, you can stay pretty comfortable thinking that way.
Something that we've talked about a decent bit is the race to the big leagues and just how quickly college baseball players can get through the minor league ranks to Major League Baseball now. And Cam Smith was on the opening day roster. We've seen Caglione debut. We just saw Chase Burns debut. From your position, are you a little surprised to see how quickly some guys are moving there? Or can you kind of forecast, hey, this guy was going to be quick to the big leagues? For me, like, if you told me at this point last year that Jack Caglione was going to get to the show before Travis Bazana, I would have been floored. Same thing with Burns and Hagen Smith. I thought they would have gotten there at the same exact time. Now it looks like Smith is a little bit far off.
Yeah, I think the hitters are always a bit of a shock because like the pitchers, it translates. You kind of know, like you can measure it really easily. We have really built out analytics to sort of be able to predict whether it's going to happen. The hitting and the ability to make a good swing decision and the ability to hit as good as we are, as good as our scouts are, as good as our analytics are still just such a black box when it's so unpredictable. It's the part where you hold your breath. They show up in pro ball. What is it going to be? And sometimes it's way better, sometimes it's way worse. And it's still just like this big mystery that is out there that we're constantly trying to solve. What is usually the reason a guy underperforms his projection or overperforms it? They just hit or they didn't. And like Caglianone's a good example of that. And Cam Smith, like all these players who move faster, they just went out and hit. Like they did all the other things that we thought, but some of them do and some of them don't. And I think that's, if you look at probably the number one driver of why we're wrong so often, it's that. It's, we probably missed on the hit prediction.
And I think that's, yeah, as you mentioned, just you don't know how a hitter is going to react to higher quality stuff, and how those swing mechanics could break down, how the swing mechanics, or excuse me, the swing decisions could break down a little bit. To that point, though, with college baseball being where it's at, again, just calling back to Omaha, I'm watching guys out of the pen throwing 100 now, and like, maybe you got that here and there in the past, but I mean, it's just insane what you're seeing stuff wise. How much, and of course, still the hitting side of things is entirely unpredictable in a lot of ways. But how much higher of a confidence interval do you have maybe in some of these solid college bats when you know that the stuff that they're facing is maybe as close to the professional ranks as we've seen, but at the same time, I know you go through the minor league levels and now they're also pushing up as well. But at least that the test that you're seeing as an amateur is maybe as challenging as it's ever been.
Yeah, I think it's something we talk about often on our staff is like, what's the best way to make a better prediction? It's shorten the timeline, and I think that's what a lot of these big conference schools allow you to do. You're not literally shortening the timeline, but the gap between, let's say, the jump between that and playing in Jupiter for us, it's just smaller. It exists, but it's just smaller than it is in other places. And there's still a lot of other factors, being a professional in general, playing in front of different crowds, all of that. A lot of variables do change. But I think to your point, the level of stuff they're facing, it just narrows that gap between what he is today versus what he is in Jupiter to what he is in the big leagues. It's just smaller, and they could still fail, but you do feel a little bit better about it given the competition they face.
Last player, kind of overarching related question for me before I kind of want to get into your timeline to wrap us up. How much stock will you place in an interview type setting with these guys? So I assume, you sit down with guys that you're entertaining taking in the first couple of rounds. What do you want to hear, and how much will hearing that influence where you stand on that guy?
So it really varies. One thing I always say is we should have done the work throughout the year and years on these players. Like for the most part, there's always going to be pop-up guys here and there. But my hope walking into those meetings is that we have a really strong background on that player already. And then if you go into our player pages and our internal system, there should be a dossier on these guys, and we know a lot about them. We've spent time around them. I always like to try to spend time around them, like in a baseball setting, like watching them hit, going through their routine together, like really getting in there with them because it's tough. I think we all know that like every one of us, it's like a job interview. You're getting most of your best, like, but it's not going to be the true sense of who you are day to day. So we try to do that throughout the year. But I do think like in terms of what are we trying to get, it's a sense of failure because it's going to happen. What is it going to be like when they trip and fall, when they get kicked in the teeth by professional baseball, which will happen? How good are we at finding that out? I'm not sure. I think the whole industry would love to say we have this measurable thing for when it goes really poorly, here's how he's going to react and get past it. But I think that's a lot of it. It's like it's the oldest cliche in baseball, and that baseball is a game of failure, but it's like maybe even more so than ever, especially if you're a hitter, you're just going to go out and really wear it sometimes in the minor leagues. And who gets past it and who doesn't? Who has the desire to be great and push beyond their natural skills? Because none of them can really just get by at just on natural skill.
Gotcha.
With that, my last player question is with the high school guys, and especially you're seeing just talent from all over now, especially like you see players from Colorado and pretty much like the Midwest and maybe areas that aren't so Florida, California, Texas driven like we've seen. I mean, Jack's going to highlight any player from Illinois that is starting to pop up, and there's been a lot more talent from there too. But at the same time, there's a wider range of competition in those areas. So you have some really exciting talent, but then it's still a little bit tougher to compare to other high school guys. Does that just put an insane amount of importance on the summer circuit? And on top of that, a guy could just be struggling a bit in that summer circuit stretch. And now you don't want to overreact to that sample and miss out on a guy. Like, how tough is it to scout maybe the players that are from states that maybe don't have as consistently tough high school competition? And how do you balance that versus a a Florida or a California, where, I mean, the regular season in high school, even these guys now are facing, I mean, Division I caliber arms all the time.
Yeah, you just laid out the conundrum really well. I mean, you nailed it. Like that is fundamentally the problem. Inconsistent conditions and trying to evaluate players off of one guy faces 70 miles an hour every day, one guy faces 88 miles an hour every day, and hey, go out, try to predict which one's going to hit. So the summer does come into that. But to your point, it's very few of them play the whole summer pillar to post. And even then, they're playing in different events, facing different pitching. It is really hard to, as opposed to flip on a Major League Baseball game, like it's sort of like everything is controlled. Everything, you're facing the same level of stuff, same condition, everything's very consistent. This is the opposite of that. So I think what becomes important is trying to get measurable things and where things like the combine come into play of like, what is like a reliable metric? What is a reliable thing that we can really lean on? I think that's why you always see, it's why you see the chase for data in so many spaces is because you know it's consistent. We're going to get the guy's bat speed. We're going to get his pitch shapes. These are things that don't lie across different domains. But again, it always comes back to if you're a position player, the hitting and the swing decisions, and it's still really, really hard to do that. So you try to control the conditions as much as you can, but to some extent, there's going to be players you have to take some leaps on because it's, hey, I really like this player, but there have been players that have not done much on the showcase circuit. They either weren't out there or they were different when they've come out and they've played in small rural areas or areas where they don't face a lot of competition. And they end up really good players. And someone had to take the leap on them, but it is a leap. This is what we talk about variance a lot. You just need to accept the level of variance that you might get and just be okay with it. Because if you try to lie to yourself and say, oh yeah, I'm sure, you're not. But that just goes with it.
One more player question. I lied. When we met in Seattle, I asked you to take a victory lap, and you said, I was probably the guy that was highest on Cal Raleigh when we took him in the third round when you came up in Seattle. And this guy is, I think, trending for an MVP right now. And obviously, you can have the conversation between valuable and outstanding, yada, yada, yada. But I was chatting with Aaron Goldsmith after that, the TV announcer for the Mariners, and he said,
Yep.
yeah, Frankie, apparently he was the guy that was like hell bent on us taking Cal Raleigh, and it worked in the third round. What'd you like so much about Cal Raleigh in a draft that had some decent college catchers?
Well, apparently, first of all, I was wrong. I didn't know he was going to hit 60 home runs. So like, even when you're right, you're wrong.
Sure.
The main thing is like when you have a chance to catch, like he does, and when you have a chance to have power, like the baseline for catchers, as we know, and it was still the same back then. The baseline to be a good catcher, if you can do a couple foundational things, is like I don't want to say low in a bad way, but low in a good way. Like it's just really hard to find high quality catchers, and especially ones who make contact in the ACC and have a history of some power production. And Cal had been hurt his sophomore year, and but he had a really great junior year, and it was the ability to make contact, the ability to hit for power. Like it was kind of a simple case, but goes to show that this is again positioning yourself to exceed expectations. And boy, I was really light. I thought maybe 20 to 30 home runs. Who knew that he'd have 30 in 75 games?
It's
But
amazing.
to the point of just how guys can make changes and things like that, I'm actually working on a piece as we speak on Raleigh. And like he made an adjustment this offseason, and
Yep.
there's the load is a little bit different, and he's getting
Mhm.
slotted a little bit different, and all of a sudden that's a difference of, and I'm sure confidence and other things too, but from a mid 700s OPS to
Yeah.
MVP candidate, it's amazing how that can be unlocked out of a player, and you might not even see it until 7 years down the line from when they're drafted, or 5 years, or whatever it may be. I do want to talk about quickly your path
Yep.
and everything as well. Like, at what point did you think you could get to where you're at now? And was this always part of your like dream to be on the amateur scouting side? Like, what was maybe your baseball dream before getting to where you're at now?
It was always scouting. I can't entirely say why. Did I ever think scouting director? No, probably not. Because it seemed like such in my young brain, it seemed like such a pinnacle type thing to do. And, how could I do that? But evaluating a player was just the puzzle of it. I've used that word a lot. Was always fascinating because of how hard it was, because of how wrong people were. And I'm like, wow, the experts are wrong all the time at
Yeah.
this. And like, this is like a real, like, it's one of the world's hardest puzzles, and why not go pursue that as opposed to something that is a little bit more settled. I worked on the big league side for a couple of years, traveling with the Mariners, doing the advanced scouting job. And I remember one of the things I loved it. I love being around the major league team, but I remember thinking, for the most part, the prediction is kind of done here. Like these guys are mostly settled business. Like they get better to your point now and then, but I always love the idea of returning back to trying to figure out years down the road what a player might be because it's so hard. And when something's so difficult, there's room to improve it. I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where we're even close to 100% accurate, but there's space. Like it's one of the sort of last frontiers in baseball where you look at Major League pitch, we've solved so much. Everybody's got a nasty slider. Everybody throws in the upper 90s. It's a lot of things have been settled where people are still trying to conquer amateur evaluation and predict these players. So for me, for whatever reason, that's always been a huge draw for me.
Frankie, before you were in a big league front office, you were writing. You were, writing for D1 Baseball and Fangraphs. I'm curious because we have a lot of people listening to this that want to be in a position like yours at some point, whether it's at the big league level or, hopefully running a draft. It's funny, like there's validity to reps in absolutely everything and getting reps at the thing you want to do. Were those reps for you before this?
They were, I think the two pieces of advice I would give to people in general who want to do something like this is one, get the reps, but also like as you're doing it, the moment I got back in a door with a major league team, you realize the world of things that, oh my gosh, I wish if I knew this when I was making predictions before, like keep knocking on doors and realizing like there are so many things if you're breaking down a player and writing a list, realize there's a whole like door that's locked behind you that you could try to open up and learn more. I honestly, year to year, that still keeps happening to me, but especially when I was writing and making the transition back into a team, you just realize how many more things there are to know about a player, how many pieces of information there is to know. But yeah, write it and keep track of your predictions. Like be wrong a bunch of times because gosh, go back and look at my Cape Cod top 300 lists or whatever, and there's errors everywhere, and also like kind of got that one right, and then you look back. The important thing too is probably to realize when your rightness, your wrongness was noise.
Okay.
Because I think there's sometimes where I was right, but I kind of was accidentally right, or I was wrong, but I kind of had the framework of the player right. There's just so much that goes into it. Don't mistake signal and noise as you're looking at it, but just keep writing them down.
My last question, building on that, it may be kind of a similar answer though, but since you've transitioned from that side of things to now with the team, what's been maybe the number one thing that you've learned about, and it could be about yourself, your process, it could be about just what you're taking away from players without revealing any valuable secrets here, but what's the one thing that maybe is shifted the most from when you were on the outside perspective versus the inside?
I would say the biggest difference is instead of trying to nail my own opinion, and some of this is a factor of just leading a department versus being in one, that my one opinion on its own it's so hard to perfect, but with an accumulation of information, one, the wisdom of the crowd is really, really valuable and layering information on top. I've learned that I am a much better overall like asset to the Marlins if I that when I'm in the mode of taking together this giant pile of information and trying to make one decision instead of spending as much time on trying to make sure that I am personally right. Now, ultimately, I have to make the decision and try to be as right as possible. But I think that's the trappings that someone coming up in scouting would come into is if you just try to judge yourself over and over again of I am going to personally nail this, you kind of can't do it on your own. Like there's so many ways to be wrong. Keep using the people around you. When I was writing, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to nail it. Like, and I had to. That was the design of the role. But now there's so many different pieces, and you kind of almost have to zoom back out and step back away from it because sometimes trying to put your own personal stamp on it can add more noise than you want it to.
That is awesome. Frankie Piliere, thank you so much for joining us. I would say this is the opportunity to plug anything that you're doing, but just go root for the Marlins draft.
Root for the Marlins draft. That's it.
Yeah.
It's awesome. Frankie, thank you tons.
You got it.